G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today marks the 104th anniversary of the Battle of Villers Bretonneux in 1918. And joining us today to talk about the battles of Villers Bretonneux is Dr. Aaron Pegram. Hi Aaron, thanks for joining us on this special occasion.
G'day, Adam. Thanks very much for having me again on the show. It's fantastic to be back, and it's wonderful to see just from the outside how the podcast is becoming increasingly more slick and professional. And I've been really enjoying the content. So well done, mate.
Thanks, Aaron. It's an honour and a privilege to have you back on. So, mate, to provide some context for in April 1918 and the battles of Villers Bretonneux, by the end of 1917 and the beginning of 1918, what were some of the major challenges facing the Allies on the Western Front?
Good question. Well, by the end of 1917, the war had been in progress for 3 years. The Australian Imperial Force had fought its major actions. Of course, it participated in the fighting on Gallipoli, which wasn't a fantastic success. It had fought at notable actions such as Fromelles and Pozières and Bullecourt and Messines. And these battles were quite significant because they were very costly in casualties, as most actions fought on the Western Front, or indeed during the First World War, certainly were. Now, that was obviously notable for the First World War, but it had a significant effect on the ability of armies to procure manpower. Most of the European nations relied on conscription and had relied on conscription for some time before the war. But the Australian Imperial Force at that time, it was raised as an all-volunteer army. Despite the initial enthusiasm of the pre-Gallipoli days, Australia had initially exceeded its recruiting quotas to provide the British government for more than 20,000 men. And in fact, by December 1914, I think they had about 50,000 men in uniform. There's about 2,000 men in the first week alone in Sydney who enlisted at Victoria Barracks in Sydney. But of course, as the war progresses and as the realities of the war sink in, there's fewer and fewer men who certainly enlist. What's interesting is that the horrors of the war doesn't actually prevent men from enlisting in the AIF. We see that at Gallipoli, despite all the newspapers reporting about the costly and unsuccessful attacks, recruiting actually spikes. It spikes so much that there's enough men then to form a second Australian division. But as the fighting on the Western Front settles and the Australians are involved in actions like Fromelles, where there's over 5,000 casualties in one night, which includes 18,000 dead, that starts to taper off. Not because, as I said, because of the horrors of the Western Front, but of course because there is a drain on Australian manpower. This battalions, which are usually at about 900 rifles at full strength, are wavering. And by 1917, after the costly battles, the Third Battle of Ypres in Belgium, where the Australians had suffered a further 36,000 casualties in just 6 weeks of fight or 8 weeks of fighting. There's a real question about whether or not we can hold these battalions at full strength. Twice during this period, in 1916 and 1917 respectively, the Australian government, the Australian Labor government under Billy Hughes, raised the prospect of a plebiscite of whether or not conscription should be introduced in Australia. And this is one of those sort of hotly contested debates that pulls Australia apart on class lines, on sectarian lines, on political lines. It's probably one of the most hotly contested public debates Australia has ever had, is about introducing conscription. And interestingly enough, the conscription plebiscites and the conscription debate actually never comes down to whether or not Australia should be involved in the war. That much is accepted. It's universal. It's about whether or not Australia should be sending its young men of military age off to the war under its own volition, under their own volition. And both are narrowly rejected. So Australia, along with South Africa and India, are among the nations of the British Empire, or the British Army, who don't introduce conscription. And so what does that mean for the AIF going into the final year of the war? Well, we do so severely under strength. As I mentioned, the costly battles of Third Ypres, the Australians have suffered 38,000 casualties, 8 weeks of fighting. and there is a big question about whether or not units can be held at full strength. There's also other things at play in the fighting on the Western Front. Russia had, of course, the Eastern Front had collapsed. In fact, that had been a German victory of sorts, I guess. The October Revolution had taken hold. The Eastern powers, the Russian Empire forces, had completely withdrawn from the war entirely, which was amazing because that actually freed up over 100 German divisions, which could then be transported to the west, and the balance of materiel briefly tipped into the scales in Germany's favour. There's a brief window of opportunity there because the United States had entered the war, and the United States had a few divisions already in France, but certainly not enough to make a significant impact. In fact, most of the Americans at that time weren't equipped with properly sufficiently equipped or trained. So many actually drew on the French cannons, French rifles, French kit and equipment, and those attached to the British formations, likewise with their kit and equipment drawn from the British forces. But there was over 1 million untrained Americans soon arriving in France, which would, of course, stop the German plans to ultimately try and achieve a decisive breakthrough on the Western Front. So as 1918 dawns, one side, the Allied forces are grappling with the severe losses that are incurred throughout the previous 2 years of fighting. Germany suddenly is bolstered. It has a material is tipped into their favour, and the Germans have this opportunity to, after several years of being on the defensive on the Western Front, finally have their opportunity to launch a major offensive, striking at the junction of the British and French armies along the River Somme. And that leads us into the start of what was become the German Spring Offensive.
So, Aaron, you mentioned that the Russian Revolution happened, and you mentioned that the Russians pulled out of the war. In your opinion, with this happening, the Germans, for them, was it a chance to strike and take decisive action to win the war, or would this have happened if Russia had have stayed in the war? In your opinion?
No, it certainly wouldn't have happened if Russia remained in the war. In fact, most of the Imperial German Army at that time was holding positions along the Eastern Front. And we really have to think of, just sort of switch our mindset a little bit. Imagine, where, a senior commander in the German High Command. From Germany, you have the, Russians in the east, and then you also have the Allies, or the, British and French alliance, in the west. Germany never wanted to face a war on two fronts, but it ultimately did, and lent support to many sort of other armies as well on other fronts. Of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottomans in their campaign throughout the Middle East. So Germany really quite soon, early on in the war, found itself supplying manpower and resources in areas where it probably wasn't initially planning. And I think that kind of really slowed down its initial pre-war aims. Those of you who can think back to their high school history lessons can remember the Schlieffen Plan. That plan that was cast before the outbreak of the First World War, that in the event of a war, Germany would very quickly knock out France by invading through neutral Belgium, and then switch fronts to then focus on the sleepy Russian bear in the east. That was slow to mobilize, but could still pack a significant punch. And of course, the Schlieffen Plan didn't occur like that. They didn't sort of sweep around to the flanks to take Paris. They weren't successful in knocking out the French army. The Russians mobilized far more quickly than possible, and within a couple of weeks, following the Britain's declaration of war against Germany, ergo, and the rest of the British Empire, including Australia, Germany is fighting a war on multiple fronts with a whole heap of other countries that it probably hadn't intended to be encountering. So, with the withdrawal of Russia from the war, that frees up 100 German divisions. That's an enormous amount of manpower and resources, and it actually takes a lot of resources to transport that amount of men and equipment and horses as well to the west. But ultimately, the Germans do so. And they had this brief window of opportunity before the Americans are combat ready, before they could be deployed across the Allied front in the west. And lo and behold, this is what occurs when Operation Michael is launched on the 21st of March, 1918.
So you just mentioned Operation Michael. So, Aaron, for people who aren't aware, what was the overall objective of Operation Michael for the German army?
Yeah, well, I just want to take a step back and just talk about the German Spring Offensive a little bit sort of more broadly, because we in the English-speaking world, whenever we think about the German Spring Offensive, we often think about Operation Michael, which was the largest and probably the German offensive that gained the most ground. Indeed, it was successful in ending 4 years of stalemate on the Western Front in trench warfare. But of course, it was only the first of a number of separate engagements fought by the German army in the fighting during the Spring Offensive. The Operation Michael was targeting the junction between the British and the French armies along the River Somme, which was a bit of a soft target. They were ultimately going to be striking for the the French city of Amiens, which was the strategic sort of network and hub of all logistical elements that were feeding the British and French armies to the north and further to the south, respectively. If the Germans could capture Amiens, the British army would then retreat to the north to protect the Channel ports. The French would withdraw to the south to protect the approaches to Paris, and there would be a clear run to the coast, severing the British and French armies. So that was what they were ultimately hoping for. There were other attacks. There was Operation Georgette, which came later on in April, further to the north along the Lys, just immediately south of Belgium, which the Australians also repelled. There was also an offensive referred to as Blucher York, Gneisenau, and also Marneschutz, which in German is the March on the Marne. So when we think of the German Spring Offensive, we often think about Operation Michael, but certainly we really need to keep in our minds that there's the Spring Offensive that begins in March 1918, actually doesn't end until June 1918. And by then, it's ultimately unsuccessful. The Germans are a complete spent force, and the Allies are battle ready, they're battle hardened, the Americans have come online, and they're ready to deliver their masterful counterstroke, which ultimately happens later on. But we'll leave that one for another podcast.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that with Operation Michael, it was, for the first phase, it was such a success. And what tactics were the Germans using that broke the deadlock that were happening, that hadn't happened on the Western Front in the previous years on the Western Front?
Yeah. So you asked a friendly question around tactics, and let's just get straight to the nub and start talking about assault tactics, and particularly the formation of German Sturmtruppen or storm troop units. So each on the Western Front, particularly among the British and the French, and also the Germans, they'd all sort of been conducting trench raids and patrols throughout the course of the war. This is what soldiers on the Western Front were doing once trench warfare had settled before the first winter of 1914. Patrols would go into no man's land to try and scout out the enemy positions, try to get a bead on where a machine gun is located, a mortar position is located, try to get a good understanding of the strength of a wire. They might try to snatch a prisoner or two that could be interrogated for intelligence purposes, or recover bodies, because soldiers carry identifications on their uniforms that indicate they are from a particular country, they are from a particular unit, which all goes into the intelligence mixture, which then gets a really accurate readout of the movement of particular units up and down the length of the Western Front. Trench raiding and patrolling was also used to instill aggressive tactics in frontline troops. There was stalemate in trench warfare. The lines didn't move all that much. And then there was a concern, I guess, from senior commanders, particularly within the British Army, that these sort of conditions would engender some sort of lethargy in frontline units, that soldiers would not become aggressive enough, they would become complacent. And in fact, in some areas of the Western Front where which actually did occur, there was an informal sort of live and let live system between the British and the Germans, or the French and the Germans, where you would shoot at each other at certain hours of the day, and sort of, not aim too hard, because that the Germans were doing very much the same. And under these conditions, you would both survive the war. But the war itself wouldn't be won either way if that was the case. So trench raiding, patrolling was used to instill aggression in frontline units. And a development of this was each army developed their own assault tactics. For the Germans, it was really around the time of Verdun in 1916. They started to develop their own kind of shock troops to infiltrate French positions, clear out dugouts, fortifications. They started equipping them pioneer units with Flammenwerfers or flamethrowers. Through raiding and patrolling, each side learnt that the principal weapon for clearing out dugouts and trenches was not rifles, bolt-action rifles, which it took time to actually load and reload and swing around in the narrow confines of a trench. It was actually grenades. And so grenades became their principal assault weapon. Other lethal arsenal of different sort of close quarter combat weapons. The British developed nutcrackers, as they refer to them, or knob kerries. And these were just quite simply a trench raiding club. Royal Engineers would cast what is a very heavy iron cog that would fit over a flanged head of an entrenching tool, and that would be used to silently dispatch a German sentry. But of course, it was completely useless in a gunfight. The Germans started developing their own automatic weapons. Assault troops were equipped with the shorter carbine rifles, and by 1918 started to be equipped with some of the world's first submachine guns, which fired a 9mm parabellum round, would have a snail drum magazine of probably about 30 rounds, and can let off a lot of rounds at close quarters. It was quite accurate close quarters, but completely useless at distance. They also were carrying bags of grenades, literally sandbags stuffed with Stielhandgranate, or stick grenades, the ubiquitous German potato masher stick bomb, which had great, made a big bang, but was ostensibly a grenade that was encased in a baked bean tin. It really had no fragmentation, and its lethal blast radius was actually quite small and no match for the British Mills bomb, which the lethal range of it actually far exceeded the range of your ability to actually throw it. So it was actually quite dangerous for the user and the recipient, both of them. The Germans really started to hone these assault tactics as part of their defensive doctrine in the fighting on the Western Front. The Germans started changing the way that they held frontline positions, adopting what was referred to as a more elastic defense, so holding a fixed position with a fewer amount of troops, almost inviting or welcoming in an attack force, and then working around, going immediately on the counterattack, splintering up an attacking force by working around their flanks and encircling them, capturing them, and killing them. In fact, the Germans, by 1917, your frontline German divisions were crack counter-attack troops. All this sort of gets in the mix. So by 1918, by the time that the Germans start thinking about a major spring offensive, they've done a number of things. They've restructured their frontline units so that each division is equipped with Sturmtruppen, stormtrooper detachment. They are equipped. They're designed to avoid getting into long and protracted gunfights with an entrenched enemy. They use the fear of the battlefront, the fog of war, using fog, smoke, noise to silently make their way around a defensive position and try to avoid strong points, look for gaps in the wire and infiltrate that way. Try to create as much havoc as they can with their bags full of grenades, their submachine guns, their Luger pistols and their flamethrowers to cause chaos and confusion, to allow the line infantry who were advancing behind them to occupy a certain position. They had a decentralized command. So orders at this point for assault troops weren't actually coming up from a battalion headquarters or a brigade headquarters. The men leading these troops from the front, your lieutenants, your sergeants, your corporals were your chain of command, and it was they who were making those decisions on the ground. The problem is when you put those junior commanders in the field leading from the front, they also become casualties. And so some of those units suffered incredibly heavy losses during offensive operations in 1918, and some of the best and brightest men within the German army at that time were killed during this phase of the war. So that's the you sort of getting to the nub of Sturmtruppen or stormtroop tactics. But I think the real kind of thing that made the German Spring Offensive or Operation Michaels such a resounding success was just the sheer weight of artillery that the Germans were able to amass on such a very limited front. And that front fell against British Fifth Army on the Somme battlefields. It's the same Somme battlefields that the Australians had fought over in 1916. What the Germans had done, using these men, material from the east, they were able to concentrate their artillery fire on such a narrow point. And within, on the 21st of March 1918, this terrific bombardment completely erupted in the night sky. I think there's something ridiculous over 1 million rounds are fired during what is referred to in artillery terms as a hurricane bombardment, which completely overwhelms British Fifth Army. It almost neutralizes the frontline units that are holding the positions around in the Bullecourt sector, and German troops using their assault tactics with the line infantry advancing behind them completely overrun those British positions. And within a few days of fighting, all those places that the Australians had fought and died, throughout the fighting of 1916 and 1917, are well and truly into German hands. Pozières, Bullecourt, Messines, these places that there's been so many Australians who had fought and died there. It's all been seemingly for nothing, and it seems as if the Germans maybe, the prospect of the war actually turning into Germany's favour is quite significant. So which gets us, by late April to Villers Bretonneux, setting the scene for Villers Bretonneux. Villers Bretonneux, or Villers Bretonneux, as the French refer to it, for many years of the war, actually was well behind British lines. There was no trenches there. The battlefield itself wasn't sort of one of of bloated corpses and shell holes and trenches and rats and barbed wire and all that sort of stuff that you think about the First World War conditions. In fact, it was green rolling fields with long grass and straight Roman roads and a lot of chalky substrate. The farmers and the local community was still living there. So the war itself hadn't come to Villers Bretonneux until 1918, and that itself sets the scene for it. The only thing I'd say about Villers Bretonneux is why it was one of the reasons why it was important is because where the Germans had started making their rapid movements on the old Somme battlefields, it was one of those towns that was in the fast approaches or the near approaches to the city of Amiens. And those of your listeners who have been to the Western Front and have been to the Australian National Memorial at Villers Bretonneux, that actually sits on what was referred to during the war, or at least on the trench map, as Hill 104. And Hill 104 sits north of the town of Villers Bretonneux, and from there, if you look west, you can actually see the skyline of Amiens, and that I think is enough of the context to then get into the discussion about the fighting at Villers Bret.
Absolutely. So, Aaron, just to go back just a touch for a sec, where were the Australian divisions on the 21st of March, and where were they? Like, they weren't facing the Germans when they launched. Where were they, and what were they doing?
Yeah, good question. And I think this comes down to why the Australians made such a massive success at Villers Bretonneux. And I think I hold a very lonely opinion, perhaps. In fact, when we think of the ground lost throughout the German Spring Offensive, of course, it's the British formations holding that ground of British Fifth Army that kind of lose this ground. And Sir Herbert Gough, who was there's this stereotype of the British general being a complete buffoon, and much of that has been completely discounted by historians. But Gough was indeed a buffoon, but it was his army that had fought valiantly. They actually did put up a good stern defence against the Germans, But certainly they lost that ground, were completely overrun, suffered enormous casualties. I think within this period, I think there's something like 36,000 British soldiers become prisoners of war within just a few days. Fortunately, the Australians are nowhere near this place, nowhere near the Somme when the Operation Michael kicks off. They're still in Belgium in their winter billets, knowing and expecting, as all British formations at this time, that the Germans are about to launch something. So they had participated in the fighting at Bullecourt throughout 1917 in April and May. They fought at Messines throughout June and July 1917. And then the Australian divisions were then engaged in the Third Battle of Ypres, fighting at Menin Road, Polygon Wood, Pol Capel, and two battles at Passchendaele throughout September, October, and November 1917, suffering within the region of about 38,000 casualties in 8 weeks, just absolutely shocking losses, and forcing the Australian government to raise that question about the sustainability of the all-volunteer AIF. After the Third Battle of Ypres, which had kind of fizzled out as winter had settled in December 1917, the Australians were rested in and around the Hollebek sector, which is just a little bit further south from around Zillebeck. It's still in the Ypres sector, but a little bit further south in a quiet area close to Messines. And there they spent the winter recovering, taking on fresh reinforcements, men returning from wounds and sickness, low-level raiding and patrolling to maintain that aggressive spirit, and still putting up a good fight in holding those defences against any sort of German incursions. In fact, they were expecting that the Germans may actually hit them in that sector, but of course it didn't come to pass. It fell much further south. So the Australians were actually quite lucky in the fact that they were not south on the Somme during that winter and the following spring, because despite the fact the Australians had developed and grown as a fighting force, they were no longer an organisation of neophytes, of newcomers, as they had been in throughout 1914 and 1915. They had learned and adapt to the British way of war, the way of integrating infantry with artillery, with air assets, and conducting quite successful, albeit costly, attacks on German positions. And also, too, they'd excelled individually as soldiers. They were skilled, they were experienced. But none of that meant anything if they were in the front line on the Somme, because that terribly concentrated German bombardment would have completely overwhelmed their positions as ultimately as they did for the British.
So, Aaron, you mentioned with the Australians, and also I've read that the Australians and Canadians, you mentioned that the Australians were starting to really become good fighters, and were the Canadians and the ANZACs, were they used as spearhead troops to go forward and push forward in the line?
Yeah, look, this one comes up, from time to time about whether or not the Australians and Canadians were used as quote unquote shock troops, and it really sort of always comes within the context of the fighting during the August Offensive, which comes starting with the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August 1918, with the Australians and Canadians in the vanguard of that particular approach. Certainly, the Australians and Canadians were fantastic soldiers by 1918. As I mentioned, they're skilled and experienced. The Germans fear them. If you have a look at the German intelligence reports, they rate various divisions, and the Australians and Canadians are always up the top as being great fighters. The Scots as well. Some of the other Dominion Maori troops, as part of the New Zealand division, they're often feared by the German forces, or they're rated as really aggressive troops that should be avoided. But I don't believe that just by virtue of being Australian or Canadian that these troops were in any way different from some of the other British formations that made them sort of stand out as elite troops as such. Because when you get down to equipment and technology, kit and equipment is exactly the same as your British soldier. There might be some slight variation, but as part of that logistical train, everything needs to kind of be consistent. So for the supply of ammunition, the training is the same. There's not a particular Australian way of conducting an assault on an enemy position, an entrenched enemy position. There isn't a particular Canadian way of integrating artillery with tanks, which are all discreetly British, into a particular assault assaulting a heavily defended German position. I think what really comes down to it is the Australian or Canadian attitude and what actions they are involved in and where they are in the line at particular moments in time. And for the Australian Imperial Force, there's 5 divisions of Australians who are engaged on the Western Front. What makes them so unique and as great soldiers is the fact that they're spared the onslaught of the German Spring Offensive, and they don't suffer the horrendous casualties the British ultimately do. They certainly pack a punch, but it's by weight of numbers that their divisions are not completely wasted away, that they are still able to render some form of assistance, whether in the defence or in the attack against the Germans. And it's for these reasons that when it comes to the Allied assault, during Battle of Amiens, 8th of August 1918, that the Australians and Canadians, as part of the British Fourth Army, are in the particular area at that time and assault the German positions that they do. It always comes down to what the high formation is, where they're located, and also to the strength of the German positions opposite. And perhaps in another podcast, when we talk about the Allied offensive in 1918, I can talk more about the state of the German army, which plays a crucial factor. The failure of the Germans to achieve a strategic victory during their fleeting chance moment, it really erodes morale, and Germans know from that point onwards they'd lost the war. So, I hope that answers that question.
It does, mate, and I think, like you've said to me before, you have to keep it in perspective, and you have to be proud of what the ANZACs did, and also the Canadians, but keep it in the overall perspective of that it was a British and French victory on the Western Front with the help of all Allied nations. That's what we need to keep in perspective, and see that it was an overall push that won the war, not just the Australian and Canadians. And I've heard it before, Aaron, where we've people have said, if it wasn't for General Monash, that the war wouldn't have been won, and you hear those sort of things, and it's just not. We've got to keep it in perspective.
100%, and I think Peter Fitzsimons, the esteemed historian, he's done a great job in talking about Australian operations and Australian military history more broadly, but sadly I do think he gets it wrong when he says that during the German Spring Offensive the Australians are slotted in the line and they literally saved the day. That's not the case. The Villers Bretonneux is a significant and an action that the Australians today can remain proud of. What the AIF did there is nothing short of marvellous. A nighttime bayonet assault without artillery on prepared German positions, literally fighting through woods and uphill to reclaim a captured town was a spectacular feat of arms. But it had much more to do with the state of the Germans who were holding those defences. The Australians didn't just kind of rush in and save the day and blunted the German Spring Offensive, which is the very simplified narrative. And in fact, it overlooks the German inadequacies, the fact that German commanders were splintering their attacking forces at every opportunity, that the German army's logistical and supply chain was very much horse-dominated, and was unable to keep up with the rapid advance that those German troops were able to. So your frontline Sturmtruppen were not particularly well supplied, well fed, and certainly when they overrun British and French positions, particularly supply and logistics stores, they have a meal. They're tucking in to British meat. I mean, the German people they've been living under strict wartime rationing after fighting a war on multiple fronts for 4 years. The Germans are finally able to stop and have a rest and have a feed. And this kind of stuff really sort of breaks down the speed of that rapid advancement. And I mean, the German morale itself, they take shocking losses, and the best and skilled, experienced junior leaders that the German army have, they're laying in waste on the ground with, at places like Pozieres and Bullecourt, trying to achieve a breakthrough. And so these sorts of things, we need to start thinking differently about operations on the Western Front. It's not to denigrate or deny the Australians the particular glory they deserve, because what they achieved in 1918 during that very stunning victory was something to be proud of. But I think we just need to be a little bit more critical about the narrative and where we can actually be really proud of the Australians, and particularly other aspects of the war that perhaps we as Australians, very proud Australians, are not always cognizant of.
Absolutely. And you just mentioned the second battle of Villers Bretonneux, and we let's go back a step and talk about the first battle and what was the state of affairs in the Villers Bretonneux sector on the 4th of April in 1918.
Yeah. Okay. So the German forces really after they have achieved their breakthrough on the 21st of March 1918. The trench warfare on the Western Front is completely ended. This is no longer a war fought from static positions. It is a war restored, one of mobility, of armies engaging over rolling fields, open plains, and trying to secure the high ground, which I'm sure your listeners who have been to the Western Front, there's actually not a lot of high ground in places in northern France and in Flanders. So the Germans are able to spearhead this advance, striking for Amiens. Again, if they capture Amiens, they can splinter the British and French forces along the River Somme, which is a strategic outcome that they're trying to achieve. The Australians are not within this sector. In fact, they're still up in the north. Now, what happens, although the Australians have been reformed under what is now referred to as the Australian Corps, Monash is not yet its commander. That comes later in late May, early June. The commander of the Australia Corps, the newly formed Australia Corps, is Sir William Birdwood, British senior officer, lots of skills and experience. Some may argue is one of those donkeys who was leading the AIF, but certainly was an individual who was much revered by the soldiers. Certainly a decent general, glad to have commanding the AIF at that time. The Australia Corps doesn't actually move as a complete formation down to the south, down onto the Somme, as other divisions do. In fact, the AIF splinters. It actually brigades are detached from their divisions and fed into the line wherever various emergencies arrive. And I think that's actually quite significant about this period, is because 104 years later, we actually don't have a unified narrative of Australia's achievements during the German Spring Offensive, but we have these brigades fighting these notable actions at places called Heberton, at Dernancourt, and Verwood and Villers Bretonneux. That is specific to a couple of battalions that fed into the line as stopgaps, as attached to a variety of different British formations, fighting literally elbow to elbow with British troops, trying to stem this German advance. And the one that I'm always taken by is the fighting at Dernancourt by the 12th and the 13th Brigades. There's a magnificent diorama at the Australian War Memorial that depicts the battlefield, the very moment that German troops spill through a very thin defensive screen that the Australians had established along a railway embankment there. You can see this mass formation of German troops actually making their way up the hill. I like it because you can actually go to Dernancourt and actually situate yourself into that diorama. The cemetery that's depicted in that diorama, it still exists. Actually, the cross that is in that, the big crucifix that is depicted in the diorama is the very same crucifix that is in the cemetery. And when the fields are tilled in the summertime, you can also see evidence of the fighting. Of course, spent cartridges. There's the aerial views. You can actually see chalk outlines of where trenches were. Just really evocative stuff that the Australians participated in. So, like I said, there's a number of different defensive actions. I think it's the 4th Brigade that's at Heberton. There's the fighting at Dernancourt with the 13th and the 12th Brigades. And then there's also the 9th Brigade, which is attached to a British formation in the forward approaches to the town of Villers Bretonneux. They're in there to plug a gap that the Germans, they fear, can exploit. And they do a really good job at holding that line between late March 1918 all the way through to the 4th of April. By the 4th of April, the Germans are sort of their initial gains, they're starting to lose momentum for the reasons that I mentioned before. German commanders are splintering the attacking force. There's extremely heavy casualties within the Germans, particularly among those junior leaders who are dying whilst leading at the front from the front. The supply chain is not keeping up with the momentum of those forward elements who are still advancing, and so that sort of progress is beginning to retard as time goes on. So I think the Germans extend their advance. I think it's probably around 50 or 60 kilometres, and once it gets to Villers Bretonneux, things start to slow down, and there is a major push to capture high ground in the area of Vere Wood, which is near the village of Le Hamel, and the Germans are checked there by the 9th Brigade. There's also an attempt to try and seize the forward slopes of Hill 104, the present-day site of the Australian National Memorial, from which you can actually see the skyline at Amiens. Why is that important? Because if you can see the skyline of Amiens, you can set up your artillery and you can shell it and bring down, vast amounts of destruction onto the city. But that German advance is checked. It's actually British troops who are holding Villers Bretonneux during this time, and they're able to check the Germans before reaching Villers Bretonneux. So the British troops, despite being overrun by those German forces on the 21st of March, are not completely rubbish. There's still a lot of fight left in them. So and that sort of brings us up to speed with some of the fighting that occurs within the area well before the magnificent counterattack the Australians put in at Villers Bretonneux and are now famous for.
It sounds, Aaron, from hearing you talk and reading accounts, it sounds like a real sporadic, quick plug gaps here, plug gaps there, and whatever units we've got. It just sounds like it was chaotic, like it was just really chaotic.
Yeah, you're 100% right. I mean, after years of stale trench, fighting from trenches where divisions move in and up and down the line of the Western Front, I mean, this is a completely different way of fighting. This is what the old contemptibles of the British Army were fighting in 1914. This is a war of movement, of trying to outflank positions, of trying to secure high ground. And certainly this is nothing that the Australians have experienced either in France or certainly on Gallipoli. It's actually quite a new way of fighting. And what the ability of senior commanders and also to logistic troops in just being able to move units from Belgium to the Somme on within such a short amount of time is just nothing short of phenomenal. Of course, units were marching on the foot. A battalion would have to march from point A to point B, but also too, if you just start thinking about the rapid movement of troops, that would involve packing them onto a train. That would involve debussing at a certain location. There would be people there to try and indicate where they were supposed to be fed into the line. I mean, we always think of the First World War in terms of your frontline soldier, armed with his rifle and bayonet, ready to take on to the German army. But spare a thought for the loggies, who are trying to coordinate all this and feed these troops and keep them equipped with enough spare ammunition and the Sally man who's trying to make sure that these guys are, despite being on the march, doing 30 kilometres of marching every day with heavy packs in rifle and ammunition, they've been given a hot feed or a cup of tea at relevant points. So there's a lot that goes into this, and I think certainly when the 13th and the 15th Brigades sort of get into the region of Villers Bretonneux, later on in the month of April, they're still marching considerable distances. And I think it's like Tom Glasgow's 13th Brigade. They do something like they march when they're told that there's orders to recapture the town of Villers Bretonneux. Overnight, they march something like 20 kilometres and move from the northern banks of the Somme River to the south. And they fall into position with 2 hours notice to spare before fixing bayonets, getting ready to assault the German positions. And I mean, these guys, they've been in combat, they've suffered losses, but these guys are battle hardened, and they're hardened by what soldiering takes on the Western Front. The fact that they've done a pack march, they literally fall on their backs, snatch a couple of hours of sleep, and they're ready to take the fight to the Germans. It says a lot about the men that the AIF were in the AIF at that time.
Absolutely, and it's a key point you touch on too, with the going back to 1914, especially like because 1915, 1916 and 17 was really the tactics had changed from the movement, and it had gone to the bite and hold tactics, and it really, like you said, stalemate. This was really the first the first time in since 1914 that there was a movement in the lines, wasn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And there just certainly wasn't the amount of time to... These crises were emerging like by the hour, which was certainly, you couldn't bring up vast amounts of artillery to support, an attack on a particular front for the infantry to then sort of advance behind a rolling curtain of artillery fire known as a creeping barrage. There was none of that sort of stuff. I mean, artillery was shooting at defined targets, and in some cases over open sites. And there was the rattle and knock of rifle fire over the various in all the woods and valleys around the surrounding area. You'll quite notice that even though it's relatively flat terrain, there is undulating hills around this area, particularly around the Somme River. And, you don't have a direct line of sight all the way through to Amiens. There's all these little woods and valleys. And each of one of those little sort of depressions in the ground is a notable action fought by the British and Empire forces during this critical time of the war. And it's a marvelous place to visit if you get the chance to go there. So it's quite a special place.
It is, isn't it, Aaron? It's a very moving place too, and it's when you go to the top of the National Memorial and you stand and you look out over the cemetery and you look to the town. You've got to pinch yourself, and actually you've got to try and imagine what it was like in 1918.
Well, that's another key point. I mean, you look west, and from the top of the tower at the Australian National Memorial there, and the whole scenery just looks like a watercolor. And in fact, it is. It's an oil painting in the Australian War Memorial that currently hangs in the First World War Gallery, a painting by William Longstaff. But from that vista, you can actually see, of course, you stand atop of Hill 104. You can see, Amiens off into the west. To the east, you can see the crash site of Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. You can see the 3rd Australian Division Memorial at Sailly-Lorette. You can see the battlefield at Hamel, and the Australia Corps Memorial that is there. So even though this is now a war of movements, and the Germans particularly are covering vast distances, there is a compressed element to this, but certainly picturesque, beautiful, and in some cases it has a very tragic story.
Absolutely, and it's something that we'll talk about later on in the podcast. But there's a quote that I'd like to bring in now, Aaron, and with the situation looking very grim, and I'd like to read this quote and then get your opinion on it. So it's: Haig attempted to motivate his troops with what Australian official war correspondent C.E.W. Bean said was his backs to the wall appeal. And I'd like to read it and then get your opinion on it. So 3 weeks ago to the day, the enemy began his terrific attacks against us on a 50-mile front. His objectives are to separate us from the French, to take the Channel ports and destroy the British Army. There is no other course open to us but to fight it out. Every position must hold to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight to the end. Some people felt that Haig was overreacting, while others felt it was an accurate assessment of the situation. Aaron, what's your opinion on what Haig said in that statement?
Yeah, look, senior commanders, when given these sort of, foreshadowing these momentous occasions, like to give stirring speeches, and some hit the mark and really spare their troops into action. And I think about Eisenhower's address to the troops, in the hours before, Operation D-Day, that being a good one. I don't think the troops particularly were stirred into action with Haig's address there. And from memory, I think that address was made around the first week of April. So after the Germans had launched their spring offensive, there had been an enormous gains by the Germans on the Somme. The British Army, British Fifth Army, was in a state of disarray, and there's all this fighting that's taking place. I think Haig's address, it comes too late to be stirring, and I don't think that it probably would have had much reaction amongst the troops themselves. I think the troops were probably too busy trying to secure their front more so than worrying about the likes of what Haig is sort of putting in his dispatches. Also, too, it's good florid prose for Haig's memoirs, and then I know there's a couple of books that have been written referring to this period of the war as the backs to the wall. But it certainly, I think, is a relatively accurate assessment of what the British Army or the British Empire forces were facing in this region of the Western Front in March and April 1918. They knew that if Amiens had fell, that the situation would be quite dire. The British and the French would be split. Both will retreat their respective ways to protect the Channel ports and Paris, respectively. It would be Alice kaput, as the Germans probably would have said of the Allied forces at the time. The war would have probably been over. But it certainly, I think there was some hope of knowing that the Americans were about to come online. The fact that they were gearing up with British and French equipment, that they were training, and there was a lot of Americans, a lot of them, that could be used to fill the gap and perhaps take the fight back to the Germans. The American Expeditionary Force at this time, was unwilling to listen to the British and the French about their combat experiences of between 1914 and 1918, and wanted to do it the American way, much to, and the exceeding American casualties during this period is during the latter phase of 1918 is probably a testament to that. But certainly just the amount of Americans that were coming and what they could bring to the fight in France was certainly a major game changer. So, look, Haig's assessment is accurate. I don't think the troops actually really listened to stirring addresses like that. Don't think it really sort of instilled them with some magical fighting capability to push the Germans all the way back. But certainly it was good for history and good for Haig, and I think that's probably where its success ultimately lay.
Absolutely. And so, Aaron, we move forward and we go into, as you mentioned, into the second battle of Villers Bretonneux. And we've got, tanks were used in this battle, which a lot of people might not know. And how important were the use of tanks in the Battle of Villers Bretonneux?
Yeah. I might just rewind the tape there just a little bit and just make the point that after 4th of April 1918, the Germans kind of really run out of steam, and that's when they start probing other parts of the front to try and ultimately achieve their decisive breakthrough, which the Germans gain some ground, but it's not as decisive as what they ultimately hope. So around Villers Bretonneux and around the Somme, the line ultimately settles. Both sides dig in and wait for the next move. And it's not until late April 1918 that the Germans try again to strike for Hill 104. For the Germans, the situation had become completely, that sort of momentum behind their initial advance had completely stopped. And this was kind of the last roll of the dice to try and capture Hill 104, immediately north of Villers Bretonneux. And they do this by deluging the whole area that's occupied by the British 8th Division, who are holding Villers Bretonneux Township, with gas. And the Brits, the 8th Division, they had done a spectacular job in defending the town. They had suffered enormous casualties. Their reinforcement groups that were coming over from England were young conscript soldiers who were insufficiently trained. In fact, they sort of nipped their training short so they could be rushed overseas to help stem the flow of Germans that were striking towards Amiens. And they too suffered enormous casualties. So even though Villers Bretonneux ultimately is captured by the Germans after deluging it with gas, and they do employ a number of these hefty A7V Sturmpanzerwagens, these tanks, which the Germans had not employed elsewhere on the Western Front before, until the German spring offensive. This is sort of shock weaponry that the British had had not expected during this time. And so ultimately, Villers Bretonneux falls into German hands. Just a little bit more on the German tanks. The first British tanks had arrived on the Western Front in September 1916 during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. In fact, if you visit the battlefields at Pozières, on the western side of town, just opposite from the windmill, there's a memorial there to the tank corps who stepped off from that point to attack at Flers-Courcelette in September 1916. So the Germans themselves, hadn't actually developed tank technology. Of course, they had, witnessed the German and French designs that was employed against their part of the front. But the Germans, when you think about their wartime materiel, tanks was not something that they could afford to produce. All this fighting a war on multiple fronts for what was supposed to be a very quick war of mobility that didn't eventually occur. The German wartime economy comes at the expense of the needs of the average German civilians. What the Germans do instead is they pump all their wartime resources into churning out submarines, Untersee boots, or submarines, for employment against Allied shipping, which is probably a more significant threat. So that is not as successful as the Kriegsmarine is hoping to achieve. And certainly the Royal Navy is blockading German ports and preventing easy access to the German U-boat pens into the north of Germany. So very late in the war, what the Germans do is start developing their own tanks. And they're not sleek or nimble or fast or anything like that. If you have a look at the German A7V, it is quite a tall structure. It relies on wheeled bogies, quite a number of wheeled bogies. It has a crew of 10, equipped with belt-fed, water-cooled MG08 machine guns, which can rapidly put out a rapid rate of fire, but certainly not accurate in any means, because the tank itself is quite heavily armored. It has some sort of 1 pound guns mounted to it, but of course this thing is just too tall, too slow, and doesn't really pack much of a punch. It actually looks intimidating, but throughout the course of the fighting, they're not very successful at all. So your question about whether or not the tanks were decisive in any way, yes, there is the first engagement of British and German tanks in what is the first tank-on-tank engagement in the history of warfare on the outskirts of Villers Bretonneux on the night of 24th of April 1918. But both tanks, they exchange a few rounds. None are successful in actually scoring any hits, and it's 0-0 for all. It's considered a draw. Were the tanks successful at Villers Bretonneux? No, they weren't. They certainly weren't. They weren't sort of the secret weapon that overwhelmed the British positions in the attack that night. I think that has much to do with the Germans deluging the area with gas, and German troops assaulting what was British positions that had suffered immense heavy casualties. Their reinforcements were inexperienced, and they were ultimately ejected from the town. With the A7Vs, tanks themselves have to rely on firm, solid ground, and I think the 20 A7Vs that Germany ultimately produced, a good number of them were put out of action. One of the surviving examples, of course, is Mephisto, and I think that example, it's actually how it was captured. It's actually a really good example of the vulnerabilities of German armor and armor of that era. It wasn't exactly put out of action by a chance blow. It stumbled into a shell hole and couldn't extract itself. It was too low to the ground, with wheeled bogies, heavy vehicle. It just simply couldn't get out of a ditch, and was ultimately captured through that means and abandoned by its crew and recovered by the Queenslanders, who forever will remind us that they captured Mephisto, the A7V.
Yes, I was going to say that, Aaron. It's got a very interesting story in itself, and I was lucky to come and see it down at the Australian War Memorial when it was on loan, and it's a remarkable machine, and as you said, you can see the damage that has been inflicted on Mephisto, and yeah, it was a remarkable thing to go and actually see.
Yeah, indeed. All that damage that was done to Mephisto was done after it was bogged and remained in no man's land from which it couldn't be extracted. So I believe some Australian Stokes mortar, Australia Stokes mortar team had directed a few rounds that ultimately succeeded in penetrating through the roof of the vehicle. So ultimately, that depth, that's the scars that it currently carries. But that's ultimately getting us off topic from the fighting at Villers Bretonneux. We're here to talk about the momentous occasion. We're finally here on this podcast
Yes,
to talk about the night attack of 24th, 25th of April. We're here.
We are, mate. So it's a good time to bring in Aaron. So who were the generals that were commanding the recapture of Villers Bretonneux? And we should mention Major General Harold Edward Pompey Elliott and General Glasgow. So can you give us a little bit of background about these two generals?
Yeah. So Pompey Elliott was a commander of the Australian 15th Brigade in 1918. Pompey had led his men ashore, the 7th Battalion ashore on Gallipoli in April, during the landing on the 25th of April 1915. Himself had been wounded in the foot, much revered and treasured by the men he commanded. He was given the nickname Pompey, and there's a number of different kind of reasons for this. Allegedly, the 7th Battalion, which was raised in the Melbourne area, they were training at what was then the Melbourne Cricket Ground, I believe. There was a Geelong footballer in the VFL at the time, also with the surname Elliott, and was known to fire up at the appropriate time. It was quite fiery and tempestuous, as our Pompey Elliott ultimately was. And Pompey was a bit of an allusion to the volcano of Pompeii. So Pompey Elliott, he would like to blow up at his particular troops from time to time. A lot of yelling and screaming at various points. I think when he commanded the 57th Battalion after it was formed in Egypt in 1916, Pompey was particularly notorious for a route march across salt plains in Egypt, in which half his formation ultimately sort of passed out due to heat exhaustion. But ultimately leveled his revolver at some of his men to order them to keep marching, would shoot them. This is the sort of blusting sort of fiery character that Pompey ultimately was. But there was a very significant softer side to him as well. He loved his troops, he loved his men, and ultimately it's the 57th Battalion that he's commanding who ultimately go into action at Fromelles and assault the German position known as the Sugarloaf, and they attack into a re-entrant, which is covered by numerous machine guns that are firing an enfilade. And he watches on, despite his protestations, that this attack will ultimately succeed. Well, would not be successful. It ultimately end in failure, and he watches his beloved 57th Battalion get almost annihilated at Fromelles. And Pompey is seen the morning afterwards shaking the hands of survivors and his tears streaming down his face. I think Pompey was certainly what they referred to as a thrusting commander. During the fighting throughout March and April 1917, he's wanting to make sure that his troops are in the vanguard and they're following up on this German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line, and ultimately pushes his troops into areas where perhaps the German resistance is a lot firmer than what they're expecting. Certainly his battalion is involved in a number of engagements that result in heavy casualties as they push into villages that are suspected as being abandoned by the Germans, but in fact the Germans are laying in wait with, again, multiple machine guns that have their overarching arcs of machine gun fire and firing an enfilade, of which the unit then suffers heavy casualties again. These 57th fights at Polygon Wood to great success. They fill a gap during a particular emergency. on the right flank of the Australian 5th Division front. And there's a number of Victoria Crosses awarded to Pompey's men for that action. So, certainly a very successful commander. Certainly a guy who wore his heart on his sleeve, I think. But I also think there was a soft side to Pompey, and a very tragic post-war story. Of course, he feels that he's passed over for promotion multiple times, that he should have risen to the lofty heights of general, and that doesn't happen. Perhaps because Pompey is outspoken and critical of senior commanders. After the war, he's very vocal and very critical of the British commanders involved in the debacle at Fromelles. And that ultimately leads to his undoing. He's checked into a mental hospital in Victoria, and he ultimately ends his own life. There is a spectacular biography on Pompey Elliott written by Ross McMullen. It's not a small book. It's one of those books that'll surely cause you frontal lobe damage if you read it in bed. But certainly, it's a fantastic summary of a brilliant Australian commander.
So you mentioned, Aaron, and for those who aren't aware, can you just give us a brief description of what enfilade fire is?
Yeah. So fighting on the Western Front, machine guns are arranged not to fire directly in front. In fact, the Germans, having adopted a defensive doctrine in the West, develop a new lethal way of employing their machine guns. And in fact, this is how machine guns are arranged to this day. Their arcs of fire, so the way in which they can be traversed left and right, are sort of become interlocking cones with adjacent or nearby machine guns. And in some areas where trenches are developed, they're not just kind of straight lines. In fact, there could be protrusions out into no man's land. There could be machine guns covering overarching arcs to the front and then also to the flanks. And in some cases, machine guns will be firing perpendicular to the main line of assault. So then when advancing waves of attacking infantry are advancing across no man's land, they're not being engaged from the front, but they're being engaged from the side. And they are perhaps falling victim to machine gun fire that's not aimed at head or chest height, but it's aimed at knee to groin height, and that thus rendering an attacking formation completely useless. And I think the 6th Bavarian, the way in which the 6th Bavarian Division had arranged their machine guns on the Sugarloaf and during the Battle of Fromelles in 1916 bears testament to the effectiveness of just one or two machine gun teams completely annihilating an entire brigade of infantry. And
We're at Villers Bretonneux. It's the 24th. It's the day before Anzac Day. And so what was the planning with General Glasgow and Pompey with their 13th and 15th Brigade? What was the planning in the recapture of Villers Bretonneux?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, Pompey and Tom Glasgow are actually some ways away. I think Pompey's men are at a village called Blangy-Tronville, which is not it's about some kilometres away from the fighting at Villers Bretonneux, which has just been captured by German forces. The British who are holding that sector or had just pulled out of Villers Bretonneux, the British 8th Division. The British seem to think that they've got the situation under control, that the German incursion into Villers Bretonneux, was completely redeemable. But what's interesting is further command higher up the chain actually coming into action and actually issuing orders for a counterattack. So while we'd like to revere Villers Bretonneux as a distinctly Australian action, there's actually orders for its recapture have come from not an Australian commander, but the supreme commander of Allied forces, the French General Ferdinand Foch, who instructed his subordinate units to ultimately down to Henry Rawlinson, the commander of British Fourth Army. And so Rawlinson instructs both the Australians and the British to recapture the town. And Glasgow's 13th Brigade, which is onto the north of the Somme River, were instructed to march 13 kilometres to join the remnants of the 8th Division in a counterattack later that day, with some of the preparatory orders for arriving at Pompey's headquarters, at the 15th Brigade headquarters at Blangy-Tronville, not that long afterwards. So it's actually quite a quick action. But the fact that it's actually come on high from Foch is actually quite significant. And I think that actually really underlines the importance of the strategic importance of Amiens. So the plan was for the complete envelopment of Villers Bretonneux. They weren't actually going to allow the Germans to prepare, fix positions, give them time to dig trenches or erect barbed wire and set up their machine gun fires for lethal killing grounds or anything like that, but to order a very quick attack to kind of destabilize and hit the Germans while they're unprepared. And so, under the cover of darkness, Elliott's men move into position to the north of Villers Bretonneux, and Glasgow's men ultimately move down to the south, to the southern approaches of Villers Bretonneux. And the plan was for Pompey's men to advance west from the top in the arch of around Villers Bretonneux, and Tom Glasgow's down to the south, and they would recapture the town in a pincer-like manoeuvre. And if your listeners have been to Villers Bretonneux, they've been to the Australian National Memorial. If you look south back to the town of Villers Bretonneux, there's probably about 1.5 kilometres between the Australian National Memorial and the town. That's the axis of advance that was taken by the 15th Brigade, moving from your right all the way to your left throughout that night. So I mentioned before about that remarkable feat of actually troops moving considerable distances on the march, being hungry, having suffered heavy casualties in earlier fighting. And I think there was also no vast quantities of artillery fire that would soften up the German positions ahead of this particular attack, as other attacks would ultimately, were defined by, particularly during 1916-17. In the latter half of 1918, as we referred to as that bite and hold tactic you were talking about, Adam. But certainly there was no indication at this stage about the strength and disposition of any of the German defences. And the finer details of the attack itself was actually being sorted out between Elliott's and Glasgow as late as 8 p.m, which is probably about 2 hours before the troops start jumping off or start moving into skirmish order from their start positions. So Charles Bean was nearby and was tracking the details of this particular attack, and he wrote in his diary, feeling, and I quote, thoroughly depressed and certain this horrid attack would fail hopelessly. So I think that's actually quite interesting. I mean, today Villers Bretonneux is revered as a great significant Australian action, but of course in 1918 he is the Australian official war correspondent and future official war historian who's expecting the absolute worst.
Absolutely, mate. And so what effect, if any, do you think the ANZAC spirit had on the men involved? And seeing as this was leading up to the anniversary of the famous landing at Gallipoli, and do you think that had an effect on the troops on the ground?
Yeah, look, the ANZAC legend, spirit, whatever you want to call it, it's a kind of a bit of a late war construction. It didn't actually come into being until much later on. Of course, we see it's seeded in the First World War, but of course it's in the commemoration after the war in which it sort of really gains ground. But certainly the troops themselves were very conscious of the date, the fact that they're fitting into positions just before midnight, on the night of 24th, 25th of April 1918. Walter Downing, who probably has written one of the most spectacular first-hand accounts of an Australian infantryman fighting on the Western Front in his book, To the Last Ridge, who refers to some of his men of his platoon, sort of getting themselves ready to go into battle, charging their weapons and cleaning their bayonets, saying, hey, look, listen, it's just about Anzac Day. So they were very conscious of the occasion, and I think that perhaps had ensured them and gave them a sense of purpose, that it ensured them of their mission, that ensured them of their objectives, what they were going to do. And it also prepared them for that aggression, and they were doing so knowing that the recapture of Villers Bretonneux was strategically important, and then also to the momentous occasion that the Australians were going to recapture this town on what was a very significant anniversary.
Absolutely. And so, what were the costs to the Anzacs in the battle, Aaron?
Well, look, if we get to the battle itself, part of that planning for the Australians fighting, fitting into the line before this event kicks off, there's some awful grim realities of the fighting. There's in the official history been records platoon commanders issuing instructions to their men saying, "Look, we don't want any prisoners." And I think knowing that they're going in, the Germans aren't expecting them. This is going to be a nighttime bayonet assault onto the German positions. There isn't going to be massive amounts of artillery to soften up the German positions and let the Germans know that the Australian infantry are coming. They know that they've got the jump on the Germans here, and it's probably just not by coincidence that the 15th Brigade, that had been completely mauled at Fromelles, is in the line, ready, in wait, to make a jump on a exhausted, depleted, morale-affected German force who have succeeded in capturing this town, but probably don't have the means to hold it. And certainly some of the accounts of the fighting, again from Walter Downing, really sort of talk about the gruesomeness, I guess, of this action, and it's spectacularly notable compared with other actions fighting on the Western Front. And I just want to sort of read an excerpt from Downing's book. Downing,
Yeah, please, mate.
Downing is from the 57th Battalion, and he's a 24-year-old Melbourne law student who, he's forming up with the 15th Brigade in skirmish order just outside of Villers Bretonneux, ready to go into attack on the eve of Anzac Day. And he describes the attack kicking off. And I quote, "German flares of all kinds shot in the air, reds, whites, greens, bunches of golden rain. A storm of machine gun fire came from the right and the front, but remarkably few were hit. Then came a wild, terrifying roar as waves of Australian infantry from the 15th Brigade emerged from the night and rushed the German positions, knowing that men from the 13th Brigade were doing the same on the other side of town. He says, a howling as of demons as the Australians surged forward with rifle and bayonet, their fierce, low growl as of tigers scenting blood. They were ordered not to take prisoners, and they killed and they killed. There was no quarter on either side." And I think that really sums up the aggression, particularly from one man's experience of this particular action. Yeah, it's quite horrific, but I think these are the awful realities of close quarter fighting, not just on the Western Front, but in general.
Absolutely, mate. The hairs stand up on the back of my neck hearing that, and you, as you say, you can hear, like you're hearing, listening to that, like the hand-to-hand fighting and how gruesome hand-to-hand fighting and hand-to-hand combat is.
Yeah, the 13th Brigade on the other side of town have to pass through a whole series of woods, notably through what's referred to as Monument Wood. There was a monument there from the fighting during the Franco-Prussian War, and there's among them is Lieutenant Clifford Sadlier and Sergeant Charles Stokes of the 51st Battalion, who, leading their assault troops, or their troops through, the assault through this wood, come across a number of German machine gun positions. And again, they're charging them with bayonets and grenades. And for fierce, ferocious, close quarters fighting, they're sort of taking them, not in the flank, but directly from the front, with heavy casualties, of course, from their respective company. And Sadlier is awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions, and Stokes is recommended for, but ultimately doesn't receive, but receives a Distinguished Conduct Medal instead. Doesn't get the Victoria Cross; he gets the Distinguished Conduct Medal. And it's actually quite interesting because Stokes later says to his children quite later on in life. Stokes and Sadlier are sort of revered as these heroes from West Australia who do this really brave action in clearing a succession of German strong points. But Sadlier sort of talks to his children about being quite affected the day afterwards by going back through that wood and actually seeing the harm that he had done to other human beings.
You sit there, mate, and you actually, the human cost, it makes you stop and think of the human cost.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think I've never been involved in an attack like. I've never been in action. I've never experienced anything like that. But I think the after sunlight at Villers Bretonneux, I think you've hit the nail on the head. The human cost of recapturing the town and actually seeing the effects of the aftermath of a close quarters fight was actually quite chilling. But look, nevertheless, the two Australian Brigades, and there was some British troops in there as well who joined in on that counter-attack, the remnants of the British 8th Division. They're ultimately successful in recapturing Villers Bretonneux. There's a complete envelopment of the village with the 15th Brigade from the top on the northern approaches between Hill 104 and Villers Bretonneux, and the 13th Brigade further to the south. There'd also been the British 54th Brigade further south still. Complete envelopment of the village. The Germans are routed. There's a significant number of German casualties who are both killed and captured, and the town is ultimately secured. The British had suffered over 9,500 casualties in the fighting throughout April 1918, and the Australians had lost about 2,500 in its recapture. The Germans had lost within the region of about 7,000. So quite a significant number of men that's killed, missing and wounded, or of course taken prisoner. And that kind of brings an end to the Germans and their attempts to kind of regain the high ground in and around the area around Villers Bretonneux. There are some other German actions that are further north along the Lys River throughout the German Spring Offensive. And of course, some of those other German attacks that are referred to come in further south along against the French sector. But never again are the Germans trying to capture Amiens and try to split the British and French armies along the River Somme.
So, Aaron, was the German morale at this point, was it at an all-time low, and could they see that the end of the war was in sight at this point, or was that later on down in 1918?
Well, yeah, look, this is a really interesting point. And again, we're straying into the territory of, the successful Australian actions that come afterwards, notably Battle of Amiens, the whole series of victories that the Australians achieved under the command of Lieutenant General Sir John Monash. But we have to realise that the Germans are a spent force, particularly those on the Somme area that the Australians are engaging. They are not crack formations anymore. They are battle depleted. Their morale is significantly low. And what they do is they hold that ground that they had gained throughout the German Spring Offensive. And then much of the fighting that then follows is pushing the Germans back to their lines before the start of the Spring Offensive and then some. And ultimately back to a position from which the Germans realised that this is completely untenable. But I think your average Deutsche Frontsoldaten, your German frontline soldier, he knows by the end of the German Spring Offensive, had he have survived those initial engagements, I think he knew that the writing was on the wall. The German army was battle depleted. The German wartime economy was completely spent. And I think that they would have known that, things were looking pretty grim for the Imperial German Army at this point. There was a legend that arose, particularly during the period of the Nazis, that the First World War was lost. That the German people or German soldiers were stabbed in the back, by people who were trying to erode morale back home. That's just certainly not the case, because as these operations on the Western Front illustrate, the German army was very much stabbed in the front by the armies of Britain and France.
It's a good point you make there, Aaron, where they were soundly beaten on the battlefield in 1918. They weren't stabbed in the back. They were soundly defeated, as you said, stabbed in the front, not in the back.
Yeah, that's it.
So why was Villers Bretonneux picked as the national memorial to the Australian military personnel killed on the Western Front during the Great War?
Yeah, look, really interesting, because Villers Bretonneux holds a very significant place in the Australian memory of the war. It's not the only place where the Australians are commemorated. In Belgium, the Australian National Memorial, or the memorial to the missing of throughout the entire British Empire, which also includes the Australians, is at Ypres on the Menin Gate. There's around 8,000 Australians whose names appear on there. They are Australians who died fighting in Belgium between 1916 and 1918, who were killed in action or died of wounds and have no known grave. In many cases, they were buried and their bodies were their final resting place was later churned up by artillery fire that came about during the German Spring Offensive. Also, too, Villers Bretonneux is the Australian National Memorial there to the missing, and there's an additional 10,000 Australians who were killed fighting in France who have no known grave. But of course, each of the Australian divisions, the 5 Australian divisions, have memorials at various places at the Western Front. I'm a bit rusty. Let's see if I can remember them all. The 1st Australian Division Memorial is at Pozières to mark its very significant victory in capturing the village in 1916. The 2nd Australian Division is at Mont Saint-Quentin, a 1918 battlefield under Monash. The 2nd Australian Division had carried out a quick attack against all odds and secured that village in September 1918. The 3rd Australian Division at Sailly-Lorette. The 3rd Australian Division, actually Monash was the divisional commander at this time, and the 3rd Division thought that its defence of Morlancourt Ridge on the northern banks of the Somme River was its crowning achievement of the war. The 4th Australian Division is against the Hindenburg Line at the Beaurevoir Line, where it punched through the last of the German Hindenburg Line defences in the later stages of October 1918, and the 5th Australian Division at Polygon Wood, where it delivered its spectacular attack against the Butt in what was a very successful, albeit costly, attack during the Third Battle of Ypres. So each of those 5 Australian Division memorials, whilst they are focused on the dead, they actually mean something to the men who fought there. They were stunning victories. And you don't see those divisional memorials placed at places like Fromelles, where the Australians were significantly, they were not successful and suffered immense amounts of casualties. So the men themselves were very proud of what they achieved during the fighting on the Western Front, and they decided to place those divisional memorials at those specific locations. But why was Villers Bretonneux chosen? It was a spectacular attack that had been carried out by the Australians at that place, and I think it was selected as the site very much because the local people of Villers Bretonneux were forever grateful for the recapture of their town during a brief period of German occupation, but also too there had been significant fundraising efforts in Australia after the war by Australians, particularly from Victoria, who paid money for the rebuilding of the town. And so that was quite significant and a fantastic gesture. And you see some of that goodwill echoed in Villers Bretonneux today. I mean, you go to the school there in the town, and there's emblazoned across the schoolyard, "Never forget Australia." Of course, you go into the old hall, which is inside the school itself, and you see small wooden carvings that sort of echo Australia flora and fauna. I mean, Villers Bretonneux is probably the most Australian place in France that you'll ever go and visit. A lot of Australian war dead that are buried there. An unknown Australian soldier was reinterred from Adelaide Cemetery at Villers Bretonneux and taken to the Australian War Memorial, and he lays now in the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier at the Australian War Memorial. So there's a very distinctive Australian connection to Villers Bretonneux. And it was selected as the site of a major site of commemoration, perhaps in some part to help rejuvenate and also to help the people of Villers Bretonneux to also commemorate the significant achievement of the Australians who were there, but then also to remember and also to generate a lot of wartime battlefield tourism, which would help generate and also re-stimulate the local economy as well. So there's a lot of different factors in there. It's not by any means a distinctly Australian location on the Western Front. I talked about the British divisions that were involved in the fighting there. little bit further south of Villers Bretonneux, the French was the division with the British and the French armies. So there was the French Moroccan division who were in action not too far away from Villers Bretonneux. And believe it or not, there was actually 2 companies of Russian troops who were attached to that division. And there's in the nearby cemeteries, there's actually some Russian troops who are buried in those outlying cemeteries. So, there was Americans who were fighting nearby in later stages of, I think, August 1918 down in there. Belgians, you name it. So Villers Bretonneux, it has the appearances of an Australian action and is well remembered. The Australians are well remembered there, but of course there are many more nationalities that are often reflected in the cemeteries in and around the town.
It's a good point you touch on there, Aaron, because as you do walk through that cemetery, you do see a lot of Australian headstones, but you also see a lot of Canadian, a lot of British, and a lot of other Empire troops that were, their headstones are in that cemetery. So yeah, it's a good point you touch on.
Yeah, it's those cemeteries are run by the Imperial or later Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and even though it's the site of Australian commemoration, that's where the dawn service is held every year to commemorate the Australians in the fighting on the Western Front, it is not an Australian cemetery. And so you will see British who are buried there. You will see a lot of Canadians who are buried there. I believe there was a regimental aid post that was set up on Hill 104 in subsequent fighting. So you have a lot of Canadians who are buried in the cemetery there. And in fact, I think there's actually a couple of Canadian Victoria Crosses who are buried at the Australian National Memorial Cemetery. So yeah, quite a significant place. But even though it's our corner of the Somme, so to speak, it's not necessarily just an Australian site. We have to remember the other nationalities who fought and died in that location.
Absolutely, and you mentioned we go there on Anzac Day, and in recent years we have the dawn service at the memorial. How do you think Australians should remember Villers Bretonneux today and going forward?
Yeah, look, Villers Bretonneux is a fantastic action that was carried out by the Australians, and I'm had the esteemed honour of giving an address on the 100th anniversary of the action at Villers Bretonneux for the Anzac Day breakfast at the Australian War Memorial in 2018. So if you're keen to learn more about the action and read about some of the things that I may not have actually covered in the course of this podcast, I really recommend that. So Adam may provide a link in the notes if he's ever so kind. But
I will, mate. I will.
Just a slight plug. But what the Australians achieved there was certainly stunning, and it really marked the series of very successful Australian actions that ultimately follows. The German Spring Offensive is checked, not just because of the Australians, for the reasons we've already discussed, and then the Australians play a very significant and leading role in the victories that follow. In actions such as the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August 1918, they and the Canadians advance with the British on the flank and capture places like Peronne and Mont Saint-Quentin. They punch through the Hindenburg line. They ultimately fight at places such as Montbretagne. These are rapid-moving actions that push the Germans back time and time again. It results in vast numbers of German prisoners, the capture of large amounts of field artillery pieces. These are tangible signs that the German army is a spent force. And it's certainly those victories that really define the Australian experience on the Western Front for me, not necessarily the casualties. We have often a tendency to look at all these battles and say, 5,000 dead in one night, that's tragic and that's horrible. And it certainly is. The human dimension of those losses is catastrophic. But in the fighting on the Western Front, battles are not considered successful if they result in large amounts of casualties. It ultimately comes down into ground gained and whether or not the infantry has succeeded in reaching their objectives. And that's ultimately what happens in 1918. And it all begins with the fighting at Villers Bretonneux, the start of the series of very stunning Australian victories in what is the main theatre of operations against the main antagonist of the war.
Absolutely, and it's a key point you touch on, Aaron. Like some of the battles that we talk about, and we'll get you back on to talk about them. Some of them are, they're not a success, but they're classed as a success. And when you look at the First World War, you take it in, and you've really, that's why I get you on to talk about it, because you've actually got to go in and actually read these accounts of battles, and it's fascinating. The whole First World War, mate. I understand why you it's a passion of yours to, and it's a passion of mine to actually go and study these battles, because when you actually study, and like you said, the cost, when you see the human cost and you walk these cemeteries, you see the scale, and you can't comprehend when you read it in an official account. When you walk these cemeteries, that's when it hits you, and that, for me, that's why I love walking this ground, and I know for you, that's why you love walking the ground as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've visited the battlefields on the Western Front. I think it's about 20 times. I used to lead tours for Boronia battlefield tours, and what I enjoyed the most was not necessarily walking the ground, but helping other people interpret the ground. So knowing that people would have a relative or a familial connection to the fighting, I was very keen and passionate to learn about what that connection was, and take a person to that spot where a relative fought or died. Not just going to a cemetery, but I was really keen to actually restore that soldier, that reconstitute that soldier, and sort of, this is the angle of attack that he was advancing to assault the German positions, and this was why, and this is why it failed, or this is why it was successful. And based on the available evidence, we know that he perhaps went in this direction here and was mortally wounded there, or those sorts of things really make the walking the Western Front or visiting the Western Front all that more meaningful and real. Because if you get away from places where the major sites of commemoration, there's still lots of evidence of the fighting. Spent cartridges, Mills bombs, blasted pieces of fragmentation from shells, and in some cases human remains. There's lots to see and explore once you get off the beaten track. So I encourage those who have the means and the ability to do so, beyond this weird COVID environment in which we find ourselves, get off the beaten track, get over to the Western Front, get out your trench maps, and do some research, and get your feet dirty in the mud of the Western Front.
Absolutely, mate. And it's like you said earlier on in the podcast, like going to Dernancourt and seeing the diorama at the War Memorial, and actually being on the ground, and you see it and you go, wow, I'm actually here. Like it's amazing, and I totally get exactly what you mean. And it's when you walk that ground, mate, it's you're walking in the footsteps of the men who went there over 100 years before you, and it's a pilgrimage, and it's a real honor to walk that ground, and it's something that you and I both love doing, and we've both had the privilege to do it, and I feel very lucky to have done it as of you.
Yeah. Certainly. I think that's my takeaway lesson for everybody listening to this podcast is, don't just read about history. Go out and sniff the ground. Get your boots dirty. Go get covered in some soft mud, because that will be in itself a learning experience. It's don't just visit the cemeteries. Go and actually walk through a specific action, because you'll learn a lot about the past, and then also too, I think you'll learn a lot about yourself. In terms of researching researching aspects of the past and actually applying it to the present. It can be very exciting, sort of bringing history back to life.
Absolutely. So just to finish up, Aaron, what are your thoughts on the new Sir John Monash Centre at Villers Bretonneux?
Yeah, so those of you who are familiar with the area, in 2018, thanks to funding from the Australian government, there was a new Australian interpretive centre that formed a non-invasive incorporation into the existing structure of the Australian National Memorial. So there is a new museum as part of the Australian National Memorial, which the memorial itself has been there since the 1930s, but this new museum has only been there since 2018. It's an interesting museum because you won't find many historical objects or artifacts from the fighting there or the Western Front. In fact, there's another museum that's actually in town in the local school that I was referring to just a little while ago, and perhaps that's the museum if you want to go see some artifacts. The So John Monash Interpretive Centre, I think, is not a museum as such. It is an interpretive centre. It's where you get to learn through a lot through digital technology about what the Australians did on the Western Front, from Fromelles all the way through to Montbretagne. And I was talking about the graphic realism of some of these actions, and I think some of those digital displays does that quite well. It's also a sorely needed place for weary battlefield travellers to rest. Sometimes hitting multiple cemeteries and going to multiple sites can be quite overwhelming. So it's always nice to pull in there and refresh in the cafe with a coffee and a baguette and have a quiet moment of reflection. What I find interesting about the site is the name. Villers Bretonneux was captured, of course, by the two Australian Brigades, the 15th under Pompey Elliott and the 13th under Tom Glasgow. Monash actually didn't have anything to do with Villers Bretonneux at all, and that's a common misconception. When it was unveiled in 2018, the Australian Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Malcolm Turnbull, actually made the illusion that Monash had been part of the victory that had been secured there in April 1918. That certainly is not the case. So I think it's quite odd that a memorial built, an interpretive centre that's built on the grounds of a very significant victory fought by the Australians is named after a commander who was not involved in the fighting there at all is quite interesting. And I'll be struggling to find any interpretive centre or museum that's actually named after a single individual who fought in the First World War. I mean, could you imagine an interpretive centre on the Somme being named after Sir Douglas Haig? I mean, the Brits would be up in arms. They'd be terrible. But nevertheless, look, I think what they do there is fantastic. And you said that you're going to get Carolyn on the show to have a bit of a chat later on, and I'd be really interested to hear her views. That'd be great. Mine aren't necessarily the right ones. I recognise that. I think what it does, it really sets the scene of those significant actions that the Australians fought on the Western Front, particularly those victories that Monash was a part of. And I said before that from Hill 104, you can see the achievements of the Australians at Saley-Lorette. You can see the Australian Corps Memorial at Hamel. These are quite significant, and no better place to go and get your bearings than a place where most people will ordinarily stop on the Western Front to visit that really important site of Australian commemoration. I do recommend people also visit the school that's in Villers Bretonneux. It's a locally run museum. It was also received funding from the Australian government at the time for a facelift in the preparation for the centenary in 2018. It does have the objects. It does have donations from the veterans who fought on the battlefields of the Western Front, Australians who men who ultimately saw their service reflected in the people in what the people of Villers Bretonneux were trying to do. So you often see small collections from soldiers who had fought there, the dog tags, the tattered uniforms, the metal racks, photograph collections, and obviously footage and film from the Australian War Memorial. So it's fantastic. So be sure to go and check it out.
Absolutely, mate. And like you said, it recently had an upgrade itself, and I saw it when it was in the old school, and they did it up for the centenary, and they've done a really good job. And as you said, Aaron, if you want to go and see shrapnel, if you want to go and see tattered uniforms, it's a great place to go. And if you want to go and see that, but also go and see the interpretive centre as well. You do come away with a perspective as well. So yeah, we won't turn people off the interpretive centre. Also, go and see both and make your own mind up.
Great stuff.
Yeah, all right, mate. Well, thank you very much, Aaron, for coming on True Blue History again and talking to us about the battles, I should say, of Villers Bretonneux. So, Aaron Pegram, thank you for coming on True Blue History.
My absolute pleasure, Adam. And I think we might have actually broken a record in terms of duration of a podcast on the show. And if that's the case, I really apologise. It's been a while since I've spoken about the fighting at Villers Bretonneux, and clearly I have a lot to say.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts. And if you feel like supporting us, you can now via our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/True Blue History, or buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/True Blue History, and check out our new website, truebluehistory.com, for more great content.